Tonight, we begin the story of a man who was never invited, never thanked, but always required. A man with one of the oldest job titles in history, yet no descendants ever bragged about him. He was paid by the town, protected by the law, and avoided by absolutely everyone else. This is the lonely, practical, and strangely bureaucratic life of a medieval executioner. So before you settle in, adjust your blankets, dim your lights, maybe grab a cup of something warm, let it slip back into a time of narrow streets, thick cloaks, and a justice system that often confused order with entertainment. You were not born carrying an axe. Nobody comes into the world with a swinging blade and a polished block. Like everyone else in your mud street village, you were born small, squalling, and hungry. Your first memories weren't of gallows, but of goats, of muddy paths, chilly mornings, and bread that always seemed to stale, no matter how fresh it was. You weren't a son of nobility, nor a child of scholars. You were a butcher's second boy. Not the heir to the meat stall, just extra muscle when the ox needed pulling, or the pigs needed bleeding. Your earliest lessons weren't in scripture, but in sharpness. Knives had to be honed, hooks had to be clean, and if you couldn't bleed an animal properly, you didn't eat. There was no destiny to your name, just dirt under your fingernails, and a father who smelled of salt and iron. You weren't violent, you weren't cruel, you were just useful, and in the medieval world, that was enough. By the time you turned 12, you could cut a hog in half the time it took your older brother. You knew how to sharpen a blade until it sang, how to strip sinew from bone without wasting a scrap of flesh, and how to keep your hand steady when an animal kicked its last. The village priest frowned at you, the baker's wife whispered around you, but no one complained when you delivered clean cuts to their tables. Then came the day everything changed. A rider arrived. Not a lord, not a knight, just a royal messenger in dull colors, bearing a scroll with the king's seal. A new decree had passed. Every village of a certain size must provide its own headsman. No more dragging criminals to distant cities. Justice had to be swift, local, visible. The town needed an executioner, and someone, somewhere, probably after a few mugs of stale ale, said your name. You weren't there when they decided. You were in the back, splitting ribs from a stubborn carcass, when your father appeared with that look, not anger, not pride, something in between. He didn't explain much, no grand speech, just a muttered, "You're chosen," and a shrug that said, "Don't bother asking why." You didn't get a choice. In medieval towns, no one did. You were too young to argue, too practical to run, and too used to sharp edges to be surprised. Within a week, your life changed. Your butcher's apron was swapped for leather, thicker than armor, dyed in heavy black, buckled tight around your chest. You were handed boots that thudded like war drums when you walked. They gave you gloves, stiff and awkward, made for grip, not comfort. And then there was the axe. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't polished for parades. It was a brutal, honest thing, wide-bladed, heavy-headed, perfectly balanced for one purpose. You weren't taught swordsmanship. You were taught precision. Accuracy mattered more than strength. One stroke, clean and quick, was justice. Anything more was incompetence. They assigned you to live near the old Gallows Hill, by the south gate, far enough from the town square that no church bell would ever call you to prayer. Your house wasn't cursed. It wasn't blessed either. Just there. Small, damp, with walls thick enough to keep out the wind but never the whispers. Nobody came to visit. Nobody ever would. You learned the rhythms quickly. You rose with the gray dawn, sharpened your tools before the village even stirred, oiled your axe while the baker kneaded his dough, and stood ready when the magistrate's steward knocked on your door. The first time came faster than you expected. A thief, caught twice, sentenced to hang. You walked through the town square, boots thumping, villagers parting like water around a stone. Children stared wide-eyed. Old women muttered prayers. You didn't look up. You kept your grip tight on the rope and your eyes on the gallows. The scaffold creaked like it remembered better days. The rope itched in your hands. The criminola, wiry boy not much older than you, trembled, but didn't beg. You followed instructions. Fasten here, loop there, adjust the knot behind the ear, not the throat. Gregor, the old hangman you were replacing, stood by your side. He didn't explain morality, just mechanics. Too tight and they choke, too loose and they dance, he muttered. Find the drop. Let gravity do the job. You did, and you learned your first lesson. People don't scream when the noose is placed. They go quiet. Too quiet. Too quiet. Like the fear is so dense, it suffocates the words before they leave the throat. The second lesson followed. Crowds don't cheer when justice is served. They flinch. They stare. They shuffle away as quickly as possible. By sunset, you were back. In your shack. The stew on your stove was cold. Your hands smelled like old hemp and sweat. You ate quietly, alone, because who would dine with you? The town avoided you, but it paid you. Your purse was heavier, your house stocked with firewood. Your name scratched onto the duty roster at the magistrate's hall. You became a tool, a function, a necessity, not a person. Years passed. Festivals came and went without your name on the guest list. Church bells rang, but never for you. When the plague visited, the apothecary brought cures to every doorstep, except yours. When wine merchants arrived, no samples were sent your way. No woman looked you in the eye unless she needed your services to cut down a body. Children threw stones near your house, but never had its superstition worked both ways. Your closest companion was the blocka chunk of ancient oak, carved smooth by countless final moments. You sanded it after every execution, polished it like a craftsman would his most sacred tool. You learned to love the grain, the way it caught the sunlight, the way it absorbed history without complaint. The axe became your partner. You learned its moods when it swung true, when it needed honing, when the balance shifted ever so slightly after a winter storm. You wrapped its handle in leather, protected it with oils, whispered apologies to it after particularly rough mornings. You were not a monster. You were an artisan, a keeper of finalities, a silent witness to the worst of human decisions. And some nights, in the heavy quiet, you wondered who your executioner would be, and whether they'd care enough to sand the block after you were gone. There were rules. No executions on Sundays, no chopping before noon, gallows reserved for thieves, axe for murderers, drowning for witches, burning only under church orders. You followed them all. You didn't smile. Smiling made people uncomfortable. You didn't speak unless spoken to. Your words sounded foreign, rusty from disuse. On market days, you walked the long way around the stalls. When you needed bread, you left coins and took loaves, silently. When you needed meat, you nodded at your brother's shop from a distance. He sliced it quickly, wrapped it faster, and kept his eyes on the floor. Family ties frayed under the weight of your profession. Love never arrived. You sent glances toward women fetching water, but they twisted away. You stood near dances, but no one invited you near the circle. Even the brothel didn't open its door to you, not because you couldn't pay, but because no one wanted the executioner's scent staining the sheets. You weren't hated, you weren't feared, you were simply avoided. Days turned to weeks, weeks to seasons. Your grip stayed strong, your axe stayed sharp, your name faded. No one told stories of you. No children pretended to be you in their games. Your laughter was forgotten before it could echo. The only place you belonged was behind the wooden door no one else touched, standing beside the block no one else looked at. And slowly, you accepted it, not out of pride, not out of honor, but out of habit. You became a ghost in your own town, a whisper in the wind, a necessary shadow. And the scaffold waited patiently. Because justice, no matter how clumsy or cruel, never took a holiday. Your mornings were quiet, your evenings quieter still. The rooster crowed, but never for you. The village woke with the rising sun. Merchants rolled open their stalls. And somewhere, children played near the well. But your day started before all of them. You rose in the gray light, before dawn, when the air was cold enough to remind you that bones could ache without injury. You checked your axe first, always, before your teeth, before your boots, before your food. The blade had to be sharp, flawless, free of rust, free of memory. A blunt axe didn't just shame you, it betrayed your purpose. You knew the weight of it by touch. You could tell if the balance was off by the simple act of breathing beside it. You honed the steel until it whispered across your thumb without cutting it. An edge sharp enough to take a head, dull enough to leave your own skin untouched. The townsfolk didn't know the care you took. They didn't want to know. They preferred their punishments swift, their justice unseen. They wanted the world to be clean after you were done, as if blood didn't soak wood, as if cries didn't echo through alleyways. You learned not to care about their silence. They wanted their food on time, their streets safe, their laws enforced, but without remembering the man who made it happen. You were, in the worst way possible, indispensable. Most days you were not called. The gallows stood empty, the block remained dry, the iron stayed cold. But you didn't waste those days. You oiled your boots, mended your gloves, reinforced the ropes in case someone remembered a heretic's name too loudly. You walked the length of the scaffold, tested every plank, hammered every nail twice. You swept the dust from your own doorstep because no one else would. The magistrate steward delivered your pay by leaving it on the stone at your gate. No eye contact, no words, just a pouch of coins tied tight. You counted it in silence. Counted it again because you were not a fool, then stacked it neatly inside a hollow in your floorboards. You never had use for much. No one to buy gifts for, no feast invites to attend, no drinkers to toast with. You bought what you needed, bread, broth, salt, and left the rest for rats and crows to argue over. People sometimes whispered about your house, that it was cursed, that it was haunted. They said voices drifted from your chimney. They said shadows danced behind your shutters. You knew the truth. A house doesn't haunt itself. It simply absorbs the life of its occupant, and your life was silence. Until a WASN single quotes. It always came in the same way: a hurried knock on your door, or a steward's shout through the gate. Sometimes it was a rider from the castle bringing a scroll, the wax seal still warm. Other times it was a villager, breathless, eyes wide, barely able to get the words out. Execution at noon. You didn't question. That was never your place. The law spoke, and your blade answered. You dressed carefully, boots laced tight, apron strapped firm, gloves pulled high enough to cover your wrists. The axe swung across your back, its weight pressing against your spine like a familiar reminder. You were needed now. The square filled quickly on execution days. It always did. The same people who ignored you, who crossed the road when they heard your boots, found their way to the scaffold. Merchants set up early. Children clambered for the best view. Mothers clutched their little ones, but still didn't look away. Justice was a spectacle, and you were the final act. The criminal was led in chains, his legs kicking against the dirt, his mouth screaming innocence or spitting curses. It never mattered. The magistrate read the charges aloud. The steward unrolled the scroll, and you stood behind the block, unmoving, expressionless. The block was your world. Oak, smooth, old enough to have swallowed hundreds of names, old enough that it didn't creak anymore. The axe was your voice. It spoke in arcs and silence. One stroke, no suffering. That was your goal, your grim mercy, in a world that understood little of it. You learned early that hesitation was poison. It didn't just delay, death had spoiled the ritual. People wanted it quick. Judges wanted it efficient. The criminal Well, it didn't matter what they wanted. You listened for the signal, a nod from the steward, a line from the magistrate, sometimes a priest mumbling a prayer. No one heard, then the swing got fast. Clean. Done. The crowd always gasped. Some cheered. Some crossed themselves. You heard none of it. You wiped the blade before the blood dried, cleaned the block before the wood stained, and left before the body cooled. You were not there to celebrate. You were there to execute. The walk back was always the same, silent, lonely, heavy. The door to your house shut behind you like a closing vault. You unbuckled the apron, scrubbed the gloves, polished the axe, and sat at your empty table staring at your untouched supper. No matter how hungry you were, the first few bites always felt like chewing leather. But hunger won, it always did. Then came the worst part of the day, the quiet after the roar. The world moved on, the market reopened, the villagers pretended nothing had happened. Laughter returned to the square. Music floated from the tavern. Bells rang, babies cried, and you sat alone with your axe, your coin, and your silence. Sometimes you looked at yourself in the small, cracked mirror above your stove. You tried to remember the boy you had been, the butcher's son, the one who could laugh, the one who thought of love, the one who once dreamed of having a stall in the market. That boy was long gone, buried under layers of black leather, under scars on your palms, under glances you could no longer return. You were the executioner. No one touched you. No one invited you. No one thanked you. But the world turned because of you. There were rare days when the magistrate called you not to kill, but to witness. Trials held in cold chambers, verdicts delivered by men who never touched a blade. You stood in the corner, arms folded, your axe leaning against the wall. You watched the accused sob, the judges frown, the scribes write. You knew most cases ended the same: coin bought freedom, blood bought absolution, and sometimes someone was innocent. You saw it in their eyes. You felt it in the way their shoulders slumped, in the way they looked at their loved ones for the last time. You wondered if the magistrate noticed. You wondered if the priest cared. You were not allowed to speak. Your job began after the last word had been spoken. Your hands did not tremble, not after the first year. They had learned to accept what your heart could not. It was not your place to question, only to execute. One winter, a stranger came to your door, hooded, cloaked, boots covered in frost. You opened cautiously, expecting a steward, but found a woman with no insignia, no scroll, no orders. She didn't speak at first, just stared at you, as though trying to see the man behind the mask. Then she said, "You executed my husband." You said nothing. You never did. She looked down, her lips trembling, then whispered, "Thank you." Before you could answer, she turned and left, leaving behind only footprints and confusion. That night, you sat by your fire longer than usual. You didn't sharpen your axe. You didn't check the ropes. You stared at the flames and wondered if perhaps you were not just death, but mercy too. It was a fleeting thought. By dawn, the next order had arrived. Life resumed its rhythm, sharp edges, heavy boots, silent meals. But sometimes, just sometimes, you allowed yourself to think. Maybe not all ghosts were angry. Maybe, in the quiet corners of memory, someone whispered your name without hate. It wasn't hope. Hope was a dangerous thing. It was something else. A flicker dot. And in your world of black leather and heavy steel, even a flicker was enough to keep breathing. The seasons changed. The bodies came and went. The villagers aged, but you remained constant. You were the monument no one wanted to build, the clockwork no one oiled but everyone relied upon. And when you closed your eyes at night, you didn't dream of fields or laughter or love. You dreamt of oak, steel, and silence, and the world kept turning because of you. Winter was the season when the world shrank. Roads turned to slush, doors stayed bolted, and markets grew quiet beneath a blanket of frost. But for you, winter changed nothing. Death didn't slow down for snow. Punishments didn't get postponed because the wind cut through bone. The axe still waited, the block still stood, and your boots still thudded their familiar rhythm through the half-frozen streets. The mornings came with a gray chill that pressed through the shutters. You'd wake before the rooster crowed, before the baker lit his ovens, before the steward knocked. Your fingers stiffed from the cold. You'd set about the rituals of your life. The hearth needed coaxing, the axe needed warming, the blade needed checking. You learned long ago that steel in winter betrayed you faster than any man. One crack in the handle, one slip of frost on the grip, and the clean cut turned into a messy affair of failure you refused to allow. So you worked quietly, steadily. You sharpened by firelight, tested the balance with steady swings inside the confines of your small stone dwelling. The axe sang differently in winter air. It hummed, colder, heavier, like it knew it would bite through thicker coats and chilled flesh. The village avoided you more in winter. People stayed indoors, and when they did emerge, they shuffled past you faster, their faces hidden behind scarves, their footsteps quickening when your boots sounded too close. If the magistrate needed you, he sent word through a servant who barely waited to see you open the door before fleeing back to warmth and company. You learned to accept it. Loneliness wasn't a punishment, it was part of the uniform. Your meals were simple, broth that barely steamed, bread that crackled from the cold. Your only company was the steady crackle of your hearth, and the occasional whisper of wind pushing through the cracks of your roof. You could hear the world living, faint echoes of laughter in distant houses, dogs barking somewhere beyond your lane, the church bells tolling each morning, but none of it touched you. And then came the new gallows. You were summoned early one morning, long before light crept over the hills. The magistrate himself waited at the scaffold, bundled in furs, his nose red, his gloves expensive. Beside him stood carpenters, rough-handed men more accustomed to mending barns than building justice. This old thing's rotted through, the magistrate said, kicking the scaffold steps. New gallows, bigger, stronger, more visible. You said nothing. It wasn't your place. Southgate. People passed there. Let them see what law looks like. You nodded once. Orders were orders. For weeks, the hammering echoed through the southern lane. The thuds of iron on wood, the scraping of saws, the grunts of laborers. You stood nearby, observing the height, the placement of the beam, the anchoring of the trapdoor. You weren't a builder, but you knew enough to speak when something would fail. You couldn't afford accidents. Accidents meant extra work. Accidents meant unnecessary suffering. Even in death, you preferred efficiency. By the time it was finished, the scaffold loomed like a permanent cloud on the village's edge. Blackened wood, iron brackets, ropes thick enough to hold a bull. You walked its length, tested the hatch with your own weight, listened for creaks, demanded the rope be double knotted and triple checked. It was an executioner's duty not just to perform, but to ensure the performance worked. You didn't care for the magistrate's speeches, the way he bragged to visiting officials about the sturdiness, the elegance of his gallows. You cared for the mechanics, the angles, the placement of the noose, the fall distance calculated by weight and age. You made mental notes: tall men, short drops, light women, longer ropes. You became a craftsman of endings, and with the new gallows came the increase. It started slow, a thief here, a murderer there. Then a heretic brought in chains from a neighboring parish. Then a deserter. Then a smuggler. The scaffold, which had once stood idle for weeks, now groaned beneath fresh ropes every few days. You sharpened more. You worked more. You slept less. Sometimes, the faces blurred together, the names forgotten as soon as they were spoken. Only the actions remained. Swing, cut, not drop, wipe, leave. But Other faces stayed. The woman who sang a lullaby while the noose tightened around her throat. The boy who stared up at you with terrified eyes, no older than you had been when you first touched the axe. The elderly man whose body was so frail it felt wrong to bind him, but orders were orders. You told yourself not to think of them when you sat by your hearth, but they followed you into your sleep, into the silence between executions. Your dreams were not of warmth and company. They were of ropes tightening, necks snapping, heads rolling. They were of cheers you never joined and cries you never stopped. The town thrived while you withered. Your coins piled high beneath the floorboards, useless. Your gloves wore thin. Your hair grew long, untrimmed, unnoticed. The church bells rang every Sunday, but no priest knocked on your door. No child dared drop a candle by your gate. The holidays came, but you sat by yourself, eating stale bread, staring into the fire, listening to the distant joy you'd never share. There were days the loneliness pressed so hard on your chest it felt like the very axe you carried rested there. Blade dash first, and then came the traveler, a foreigner, cloaked in strange fabrics, his horse steaming in the chill of the village square. His dialect twisted, his coin heavy. He spoke to the magistrate in private chambers, but the steward couldn't keep quiet. Whispers reached you through cracks in tavern doors and gossiping lips. War on the horizon. Noble disputes, bandits growing. Bold, the king demanded order, demanded examples be made. The gallows would not be idle this winter. The executioner would earn his wage. You didn't flinch. You didn't blink. You simply cleaned your blade, prepared your rope, oiled your boots, and waited. The gallows became your world, the scaffold your cathedral, the block your altar, the axe your sermon. And you wondered, quietly, in those moments of bitter wind and crimson-streaked wood, whether there would ever be an end for you. Not the swing of your own axe, no one dared that. Not Exiliu were too necessary for that, no. You wondered whether your end would come in silence. One day, no steward would knock, no magistrate would call. The gallows would sit unused, rotting like the old one before it. The axe would grow dull, the ropes would fray. You would sit in your cold house, waiting, listening for footsteps that never came. And when your heart finally stopped beneath the weight of memory and loneliness, no one would know. No one would knock. The house would remain shut. The axe would gather dust, and your bones would rest alone, as they had lived. You breathed deep, shook the thoughts away, and stood, because duty waited, and death did not pause for dreams. In the distance, the steward's boots echoed through the slush. Another name, another crime, another neck. The executioner's rhythm never broke, and you stepped into the wind. The axe familiar in your grip, the world just distant enough to forget you existed, just the way they liked it, and just the way it would always be. Spring crept in quietly, softening the edges of winter, but not the sharpness of your days. The snow melted, rivers swelled, the market returned to life. Chickens clucked in yards again, children ran barefoot through thawed mud, and flowers sprouted stubbornly between the cracks of the church steps. The village, for all its rituals, renewed itself as it always did. But your life did not follow the seasons. Your mornings remained the same, sharpened steel and damp cloth, leather gloves and silence. The only sign of spring in your world was the sweat that came faster under your heavy apron, and the smell of blood that lingered longer on warmer wood. The gallows stood untouched by time, beams weathered but solid, ropes clean but unforgiving. The scaffold groaned softly in the breeze, like a sleeping giant that dreamed of judgment. You visited it every morning, walking the length of the boards, testing each hinge and latch, tightening every knot. There was comfort in the repetition. In a world where you had no friends, no family, no laughter, you had the certainty of routine. The block remained firm, the rope remained true, the axe remained sharp. The magistrate sent word more often now. The kingdom had become restless. Bandits roamed the forests, rebellions whispered through distant valleys, and the church spoke louder from the pulpit, demanding purity, demanding punishment. You didn't follow the sermons, but you heard enough through the stone walls of your house to understand. Sinners multiplied in the eyes of men who thirsted for control, and that meant work. In those days, you did not even bother removing your boots at night. The knock could come any hour, and you no longer cared for the comfort of bare feet. You slept by your hearth, half-dressed axe resting beside your hand. When the summons came, you opened the door without hesitation, without question, without emotion. The gallows saw all types: thieves, whose hands had already been taken, drunkards who had stumbled one insult too far, heretics whose prayers sounded foreign to the ears of frightened priests. You delivered judgment equally. A body was a body, a neck was a neck. The drop cared little for innocence, the blade even less. But one day, the names changed. It began subtly. A steward whispering that the merchant's son had been caught conspiring. The blacksmith's cousin accused of sheltering deserters. You noticed the growing nervousness in the magistrate's eyes, the swiftness with which the scribes wrote names you'd known your whole life, people you'd grown beside, people who had once smiled at you before your title marked you untouchable. You stood behind the block as each one was dragged to the scaffold. You tightened the rope. You waited for the signal. You did your job. But your dreams soured now. When you stared at the fire at night, you no longer saw the faces of criminals, but of neighbors. The baker who used to leave extra bread near your gate. The farmer who once lent you a knife when yours broke. The old woman who had whispered thank you when you had lifted her fallen basket. You reminded yourself of your duty, of the weight of the axe, of the law that guided your hands. But the silence of your house grew heavier. The walls, once thick enough to muffle the world, now pressed inwards with the memories of those you'd known. Your coins collected dust, untouched beneath the floorboards, as if they too resented their origin. One evening, the magistrate visited you, a rare occurrence. He brought no steward, no guards, only himself and his wine-slicked tongue. "The kingdom needs cleansing," he said, swirling his goblet. "A time of renewal. We must burn the weeds before the harvest." You said nothing. You only stared at his soft hands, the absence of scars, the polished rings that never gripped a rope, never swung an axe. "You understand, don't you?" he asked. You nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the inevitable. The list grew longer, names you could no longer avoid recognizing, voices that had once called your name with kindness, now trembling beneath the weight of accusation. The scaffold grew darker with use, the wood stained deeper, the air around it thick with the stench of sweat and fear. You kept your hands steady. Your swings remained clean, but your nights fractured. Sleep became a stranger. You woke to the imagined sound of ropes tightening, the thud of bodies dropping. You sat by your cold hearth long after the embers had died, staring at your calloused palms, wondering when your humanity had slipped away. And then came the child, barely old enough to hold a dagger, charged with theft and insubordination, sentenced by trembling magistrates, desperate to appease a distant king's wrath. You stood behind the block, heart heavy for the first time in years. The boy cried, not from fear, but from confusion. His eyes darted around the square, searching for someone, anyone to save him. You looked at the magistrate, at the priest, at the crowd pretending not to see. The signal came. Your hands did not tremble. Your blade did not falter, but your heart cracked. That night, you did not return home. You walked the length of the village, down paths you hadn't dared tread in years. You passed shuttered windows and silent doors, memories clinging to every step. You stood by the well where you had once fetched water as a boy, by the chapel where you had sat in the back row, dreaming of something other than steel and rope. But dreams were for other men. You returned home before dawn, your boots heavy, your throat dry. The axe leaned against the wall, its blade catching the faintest glow of moonlight. You stared at it, wondering if it would ever be clean again. The next morning brought another knock, another name, another ending. You dressed in silence, your movements mechanical. The gallows waited. The crowd gathered. The world spun forward, dragging you with it. And you realized, standing there beneath the noose, that you were not just the executioner of men. You were the executioner of yourself. With every drop, every swing, every cut, you severed pieces of your own soul, scattering them across the scaffold, leaving only a hollow shell bound by duty and silence. The world thrived on your isolation, and you endured, because the world required it, and because no one else would bear the blade. Summer came with the kind of quiet cruelty that only the seasons understand. It did not burst through the village gates with celebration. It crept in slowly, first with the stubborn bloom of wildflowers peeking between cobblestones, then with the hum of insects returning to life, and finally with the rising heat that clung to your skin and soured the air in your home. To others, it was a time of abundance. To you, it was simply a shift in discomfort. For the common folk, summer meant market stalls brimmed with ripe fruit. Children raced barefoot through puddles that shrank each day, and lovers lingered beneath blossoming trees after the evening bells. Life swelled in the village square, voices louder, colors brighter, songs longer. The smell of roasted meats wafted through narrow lanes, and for those with softer professions, there was a kind of joy in sweating under the sun, knowing winter was far away. But you did not count days by the harvest. You counted by names, and in the summer heat, names came faster. You rose before the sun, when the air was still tolerable and shadows remained soft against your walls. You washed in cold water that refused to refresh, dressed in heavy leather that stuck to your back within minutes, and performed your silent rituals of steel and rope. You kept the axe sharp and the gallows clean. You counted the cracks in the scaffold's beams, replacing planks as needed, patching old stains with fresh oil. The village woke after you, stretched lazily into life as you finished your morning rounds. Merchants shouted their wares while you wiped the residue of iron from your palms. Smiths hammered steel as you locked away the tools no one else dared to touch. Children ran screaming with joy while you counted the number of fresh nooses hanging from the hooks in the magistrate's storeroom. And though the sun smiled on the town, your world remained a long corridor of duty and silence. You noticed the changes in the magistrate first. His steps were more hurried, his voice sharper, his scrolls thicker. The steward visited you almost daily now, knocking with that familiar rhythm that told you when to expect work before a word was spoken. The steward never made eye contact anymore, not out of disgust that had long passed, but out of weariness, as though delivering orders to you drained something from him each time. In the summer months, the crimes multiplied. Some were small, petty theft from the market stalls, drunken brawls beneath the tavern windows, pickpockets caught red-handed. Others were more sinister plots whispered too loudly in ale-soaked corners, coins hidden from the tax collectors, heresies murmured in the quiet before dawn. And then there were those crimes that weren't really crimes, but merely inconveniences to the wrong man, spoken at the wrong time. You did not ask questions. You had long unlearned curiosity. You only opened the door, accepted the summons, prepared your hands, and followed the duties that had shackled you since youth. It was during this heat-soaked season that pilgrims flooded through the village gates, dust-caked travelers, tattered robes brushing against dirt lanes, staffs clattering with relics, voices chanting half-remembered prayers. They came in waves, seeking miracles, chasing redemption in distant monasteries, worshipping sacred bones, buried under moss-covered abbeys. The villagers welcomed them with coin in their eyes. Taverns swelled, markets thrived, beds were rented, and blessings were sold for the right price. But while the villagers smiled, the pilgrims frowned at you. Unlike the locals, they did not avert their gaze in fear. They watched you openly, judging, condemning, whispering to their companions as you passed. You, with your boots too heavy, your gloves too thick, your stare too cold. You were not a soul on a sacred journey. You were the anchor chained to the scenes they prayed to escape. It did not bother you, not anymore. You had no room left for offense. But the village was restless that summer. Heat and hunger stirred tempers. Men grew reckless. Accusations flew faster than doves from the church tower. The gallows creaked more often beneath the weight of fresh judgment. And then came the decree for the summer blessing. It was meant to be a festival of light and joy, a celebration of the harvest to come, a gathering to honor the saints and thank the heavens for fertile soil. In your distant memory, you recalled dancing figures in the square, candles flickering in windows, songs sung long into the night. That was before you bore the title of executioner, before your name was written in whispers. You expected, as always, to be forgotten. But the magistrate had other plans. The steward arrived one morning, scroll in hand, throat cleared awkwardly, delivering an order that tasted more like a punishment than a command. You were to attend, not hidden, not cloaked, but present in full uniform, an honored guest, or rather, a warning. To remind the village of order, the steward mumbled. You said nothing. You dressed as instructed. You oiled your axe until it gleamed beneath the fading afternoon light. You stood where you were placed, a statue of discipline amidst the tide of merriment. The village did not look at you. They looked through you, past you, around you. Laughter swirled in the air. Mugs clashed. Dancers twirled. The magistrate gave speeches about law and prosperity, about justice and the peace it preserved. When he raised his goblet high, he pointed in your direction, a grim salute to your loyalty. The villagers applauded, but none clapped with sincerity. Their cheers faltered when their eyes met yours. Their smiles dimmed in your shadow. For a brief moment, you were the centerpiece of their festival, not as a protector, but as a warning from the gallows. You returned home alone that night, as you always did, the echo of hollow celebration trailing behind you. You peeled the leather from your skin, sat by your cold hearth, and stared at the iron laid beside your boots. The next day brought another name, another crime, another ending. You did your duty. You performed your task. You walked beneath the scorching sun, watched by pilgrims, ignored by neighbors, needed but unloved, essential but unwelcome. And when the stars blinked awake each evening, you listened to the laughter from the distant tavern, the prayers from the chapel, the songs from young lovers courting beneath moonlight, inside your stone walls. The only song was the silence you knew too well. Your heart remained quiet, your axe remained sharp, and your soul, piece by piece, grew heavier beneath the weight of the summer heat. Autumn arrived like a slow, creeping tide, swallowing the blazing summer in careful, measured gulps. The sky changed, first clear blue, giving way to soft gray, then two clouds that threatened rain, but mostly held it back. The wind picked up in the evenings, the air turning sharper, cooler, less forgiving. Leaves curled at their edges, then dropped in swirling bursts of orange and brown, carpeting the narrow lanes of the village in brittle decay. For the townspeople, it was a time of preparation. The fields yielded their final bounty, the barns filled with grain. The hearths were stocked with logs stacked high against the walls. Markets swelled with salted fish, pickled vegetables, strings of onions and garlic swinging from wooden beams. Children gathered chestnuts, merchants haggled harder, and church bells tolled longer prayers for a gentle winter. But for you, autumn meant something else entirely. Autumn meant the approach of the king's tax collectors, and with them, the rise in judgment. In the cold months, every copper coin grew heavier in the palm, every debt felt sharper, every offense more costly. The gallows creaked louder as magistrates found it easier to offer death than forgiveness, and your name was summoned more than your shadow wished to follow. The mornings grew colder, your breath fogging in the chill air as you dressed in leather that refused to warm. Your gloves stiffened overnight, your boots took longer to soften beneath your step, and the iron you wielded bit colder against your skin. Yet your routine remained unchanged. Before the first light broke over the village roofs, you stood beneath, flickering torchlight, tending to tools, checking the tightness of knots, the sharpness of edges, the steadiness of beams. You knew the scaffold would see more weight in the coming weeks. You felt it in the way the steward knocked faster, in the way the magistrate's eyes darted quicker when passing by your door. It was a season of reckoning, and you were its instrument. The village changed around you. The air tasted different, and spice instead of ripe fruit, boiled meats instead of fresh bread. People rushed through the lanes, heads lowered, steps quicker, voices softer. They greeted each other with smiles stretched thin, with eyes darting toward the notice board by the magistrate's house, wondering whose name might appear next. You walked among them, not as one of them, but as the reminder of their boundaries. Your boots thudded along cobblestones. Your gloves creaked softly with every flex of your fingers. Your hood sat heavier on your shoulders as though even the fabric understood the burden it carried. The pilgrims had gone now, their summer journeys completed, leaving behind only rumors of distant miracles and roads caked in drying mud. Merchants closed earlier, farmers stayed longer in their barns, and at every corner, you saw the same glance cast your way, half fear, half resignation. You learned to ignore it, but it was always there pressing against your back like a weight. That never eased. Then, as the nights stretched longer and the winds howled louder, came the royal decree. A messenger arrived, cloaked in the king's colors, bearing a scroll sealed with heavy wax. The steward, already pale from the early frost, delivered the news with shaking hands. The king demanded a demonstration of order, a public reckoning, a show of discipline, as winter crept close, to remind his people of the crown's reach. In the furthest villages tucked against the edges of forgotten forests, you listened, standing at your doorframe, watching the steward's lips move, hearing the words fall like stones into your chest. A triple execution, 3 names, read aloud in the square, chosen not for justice, but for spectacle. You accepted because you had no choice. Preparations began immediately. The scaffold was reinforced, new beams dragged in from the woods, fresh rope ordered from the distant rope walk in the next town over. The magistrate hired extra guards, though you knew well enough their presence was for show, not need. You would do your duty alone, as you always did. As the days ticked by, whispers spread like wildfire through the village. Mothers gathered there, children closer, men drank more heavily at the tavern. The church filled with extra prayers that rang hollow against the stone walls. And you oiled the axe until it reflected your own grim expression back at you, its blade cold and gleaming beneath the muted autumn light. You walked the perimeter of the scaffold, tightening every bolt, pressing against every board, ensuring every inch was unyielding. You checked the gallows thrice, adjusted the lever, tested the ropes, rebalanced the trapdoor. You counted steps, memorized timings, prepared your hands to work without thought or hesitation, because in the morning, the crowd would gather. They came earlier than you expected, by sunrise. The square swelled with faces locals, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Merchants standing stiffly, travelers lingering at the edges. Faces lit by the glow of torches, even as the first pale light peeked from behind the hills. You stood behind the scaffold, the hood drawn over your features, the gloves tightened around your wrists, the heavy axe resting across your shoulders like a cross you had carried your whole life. The magistrate gave his speech, his words empty even to his own ears. He spoke of duty, of justice, of loyalty to the crown. He called the names, and each time his voice rang out, you saw the crowd shift. parting to let the condemned be dragged forward. First came a young man, no older than your own forgotten youth, charged with stealing grain from the magistrate's own storehouse. His eyes burned with hunger, his shoulders too thin beneath his fraying tunic. He walked without resistance. Next came a widow, accused of speaking ill of the tax collector, her fingers twisted around the beads of a broken rosary, her lips moving, in silent prayer that no saint would answer. Last, a farmer who refused conscription, his calloused hands now bound before him, his face lined not with guilt, but with years of toil, now reduced to a number on the magistrate's list. You said nothing, no. You showed no mercy, but also no cruelty. Your hands were steady as the sun climbed higher, your grip firm as the crowd grew restless. Children peeked through gaps in cloaks, men whispered behind hands, women crossed themselves again and again. You did your duty, just as winter was preparing to do its own, stripping the land bare, testing the strength of those who remained. By midday, it was over. The crowd dispersed, some lingering with forced conversation, others rushing back to their homes, hoping to scrub the image from their minds with warm stew and stronger drink. You walked home alone, your boots splattered with mud and something thicker. You passed the church, where the bells told hollow sympathy. You passed the tavern, where mugs were raised in toasts you would never hear. You passed your neighbors, their shutters drawn, their heads turned. Your key scraped against the lock, your door creaked open. Your house welcomed you back with its familiar emptiness. You peeled the gloves from your fingers, flexed them against the cold, felt the aches settle deep in your bones. You placed the axe against the wall, leaned it carefully, as though it too was exhausted. The fire was low, the woodpile shrinking, the roof groaning against the autumn wind. You sat in your chair, staring at nothing in particular, letting the silence settle like snow upon your shoulders. Outside, the world prepared for winter. Inside, you prepared for the next name, because there would always be another, because the executioner's work was never done, and the quiet life you once imagined was as distant as the springtime, locked away behind stone walls and cold iron. Winter arrived not with a sudden crash, but with a creeping inevitability, like a slow leak in the roof you could never quite patch. The first snow was thin, harmless, a light dusting that vanished by midday. But then came the wind, the gray, skies thick with clouds that pressed down like a leaden hand. And finally, the heavy snow, falling in relentless silence, covering every road, roof, and memory beneath a frozen white shroud. For the village, it was a time of retreat. Markets emptied earlier, windows closed tighter, smoke curled endlessly from chimneys. The streets fell quiet, apart from the occasional crunch of hurried boots over fresh snow, or the mournful creak of wooden shutters, rattling against the wind. Festivals were done. Harvest was long stored. Winter was not for joy, it was for survival. For you, winter was an echo chamber. Inside your stone rectangle, the walls seemed to press inward. The cold burrowed through the cracks, no matter how much. You stuffed them with straw, or patched them with leftover cloth. Your hearth burned low. Most night's wood was expensive, and warmth was wasted on the executioner. You slept with your cloak wrapped tightly around you. Your gloves hung near the fire, your boots lined with straw to keep the frost from biting your toes before morning. But cold was only a fraction of it. The winter months brought something worse. Boredom. Crime dulled beneath snow. Fewer people wandered far enough to commit sins loud enough to warrant your attention. The magistrate's scrolls came less frequently. The stewards knocked rare. And you found yourself lingering in your chambers, tending to weapons that didn't need sharpening, oiling tools already gleaming. Staring out a tiny frost-glazed window at a world determined to forget you existed. It was an unsettling thing. This quiet. You found your feet pacing the stone floor more than usual, hands flexing without reason, jaw clenching at the absolute absence of duty. Days stretched long, nights longer. Meals became more meager. Bread grew harder, stew thinner. You counted the rings in the ceiling beams, the lines in your palms, the knots in the ropes you didn't need to use, until the messenger arrived. He came from the north, his horse barely alive beneath him, his cloak soaked through, a royal crest, emblazoned on a scroll so heavy it nearly snapped the leather ties binding it. The steward's knock returned, more urgent this time, as he stood at your threshold, with snow melting down his sleeves and lips tinged blue from cold. A criminal. Transport, he managed, teeth chattering, passing through. Rest here 3 days. Orders from above. They wish you to house them. You blinked, the words sinking in like the slow drip of melting icicles. You, the village executioner, whose door had only ever known solitude, would now host prisoners, dangerous men in iron chains and thicker cloaks, condemned souls on their way to distant gallows or deeper dungeons. It was unprecedented, unwelcome, unavoidable. Preparations consumed the next sunrise. You cleared the secondary chamber, dragged in the old shackles from beneath the scaffold, hammered reinforcements into the walls of your already fortified home. The steward returned, less pale but no less wary, carrying extra straw, a few sacks of hardened bread, salted meat, and a large rusty key that felt colder than the steel you usually held. They'll arrive by dusk, he said before retreating, not wishing to linger, and they did, 4 of them, each flanked by 2 guards, faces gaunt, skin dirt-streaked, eyes gleaming with the kind of wildness that came from knowing every step forward was 1 step closer to a rope. Their crimes varied: one, a murderer, his hands still swollen from the fight that had sealed his fate; one, a poacher turned bandit; one, a soldier gone rogue after refusing a lord's command; and one, a man accused of heresy so loud it reached the ears of distant bishops. They were chained together at the ankles, wrists manacled, necks bound with iron loops attached to thick ropes. The guards barely loosened even as they shoved them through your door. Your quiet world shattered in a single evening. Your hearth blazed brighter, not by choice but by necessity, for their presence brought with it more than chill bodies steaming from the snow, breath filling the room with curses and grunts, boots stomping mud across your meticulously swept floor. The guards stood watch in shifts, drinking your thin ale, muttering about roads blocked by snow, delays in their return, rumors of highwaymen lurking beyond the tree lines. You barely spoke. You kept to the edges, tending to the iron, checking locks twice, thrice, never trusting anyone's assurances. You listened to their muffled conversations about distant towns, unfair trials, lost families, foolish mistakes. You noted the subtle shift in their gazes when they realized who you weren't just a host, but the man who ended journeys. Their words grew quieter after that. On the second day, a storm trapped everyone inside. The wind howled like a cursed choir, snow pelted the roof in furious bursts, and the door creaked beneath the weight of icy gusts. The guards cursed their luck, the prisoners curled tighter in their chains, and you sat closest to the hearth, sharpening your blade not for necessity, but for comfort. It was in this forced confinement that something strange happened. They talked, not to you never directly, but around you, past you, as though your silence formed a boundary they could skirt but never cross. Tales were shared, grim humor exchanged, dreams of impossible escapes floated among the flickers of firelight. The guards, less formal now, shared old stories from distant campaigns, lamented the weight of their own duty, compared scars, and shared bread dipped in sour wine. You listened because there was nothing else to do. You watched as men condemned to death spoke of childhoods not unlike your own, of mistakes grown too large to be contained, of decisions made under duress, of moments when survival demanded more than virtue allowed. You didn't judge them. That had never been your role. You didn't forgive them. That was beyond your power. You simply observed, and by the third morning, when the storm subsided and the path to the northern stronghold cleared, you helped rechain them, tightened the manacles, ensured the locks clicked firmly shut, and escorted them back through the snow-dusted square, toward the waiting sleds, one of them. The soldier turned as they loaded him last, his eyes lingering on you for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Strange life you lead, he muttered, lips cracking from the cold. You didn't respond. You didn't need to. The procession moved on, vanishing beyond the ridge as hooves kicked up slush, as guards barked orders, as chains rattled into the distance. You returned to your hollow home. The silence was louder than ever. You scrubbed the floors twice, burned extra wood to chase away the lingering stink of too many bodies in one space, rechecked every shackle, every rope, every corner for signs of wear. You patched the cracks that had formed during the storm, reset the traps along your doors, oiled every inch of steel until your palms burned, and when night fell, you sat by the hearth, staring at the empty space where they had lingered, where life had briefly disrupted your ordered solitude. You wondered, for a fleeting moment, whether your name would ever make its way to a distant village mettered by travelers, remembered by guards, condemned by priests. You closed your eyes, letting the crackle of the fire lull you into uneasy rest. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in suffocating quiet, and you remained where you always had been in the cold. Forgotten corner of the world, necessary but unloved, present but unwanted, breathing but not quite alive, because the executioner's duty was never really done. Winter thickened its grip on the land, swallowing the world beneath layers of white silence. The days shortened into gray slivers of muted light, and the nights stretched endlessly, stitched together by the ceaseless whisper of wind scratching against shuttered windows. Snow piled high along the narrow lanes of the village, sealing doors, muffling footsteps, and muting the distant toll of the church bell. It was the season where even the bravest souls stayed indoors, wrapped in wool and warmed by weak fires. But you remained, as you always had, in your lonely dwelling pressed against the northern wall of the town square, half home, half prison, an address known by all, visited by none. Weeks passed after the prisoners were escorted north, and the memory of their presence became just another shadow within your walls. The floorboards groaned under your solitary pacing. The iron shackles, hanging from the beams, clanked occasionally in the draft, and your tools, your closest companions, gleamed cold and obedient from their neatly organized racks. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, maintenance without purpose, routines without interruption, duties waiting for summons that never came, until the unexpected letter arrived. It bore the royal seal, thick wax pressed with the emblem of the distant king, who had, until now, remained a distant echo in your world. The steward delivered it himself, breathing hard from the uphill trek through knee-deep snow. His words brief and nervous. The castle. They summon you. Your brow furrowed beneath your hood. Summoned not for a village scuffle, not for a market thief, not for another faceless name pulled from the magistrate's list. Summoned to the castle, a place where the walls rose high enough to scrape the clouds, where banners whipped in winds far colder than these village gusts, where lords plotted beneath fur cloaks and knights sharpened steel for battles that stretched beyond your imagination, and they wanted you. Your belongings packed quickly. There wasn't much to take: your gloves, your cloak, the axe you had come to know like a second arm. A few coins saved over the years, not because you desired wealth, but because you never had anything worth buying. The steward arranged for a horse, the same reluctant animal that usually pulled refuse carts, now pressed into service for you. The villagers watched from behind frosted windows as you mounted in silence, their faces marked with the same blend of fear and relief. Fear because you remained what you were. Relief because, for once, you were leaving. Snow fell heavier as you rode north, the road winding through skeletal woods, over frozen streams, past long-abandoned watchtowers, and forgotten milestones. The world shrank behind you, the tiny village, the crooked steeple, the stone shack with its iron bolt saw, dissolving into the blizzard. The castle appeared after 3 days of travel, rising like a jagged tooth from the earth, its gray spires piercing the swirling clouds. Torches flanked its grand gate, casting weak halos of light onto snow that reached as high as a grown man's chest. Inside, you were greeted by men dressed in fine furs but armed with cold stares. Servants scurried away from your path. Guards shifted uneasily when you passed, and noble courtiers whispered behind embroidered sleeves. Their words too hushed for your ears, but their meaning as clear as ever. You were an anomaly here, a man of low birth, wrapped in worn leather, bearing tools of death instead of crests of nobility. They led you through stone corridors colder than the deepest dungeon, past grand halls and long dining tables adorned with food you had never tasted, to a chamber small and shadowed, where the king's steward awaited behind a desk piled with scrolls. His message was simple. A traitor had been caught, someone of importance, someone whose name was spoken in the great halls. Someone whose execution would not be whispered about in hidden corners, but broadcast from the ramparts, meant to echo across every hill and valley. It had to be done publicly, it had to be done cleanly, and it had to be done by you. You accepted with the same silent nod you had given your village magistrate 100 times before, though your heart felt heavier than it ever had. For 2 days, you remained within the castle walls, treated with the kind of respect reserved for necessary tools. You ate alone in the servants' quarters. You slept near the stables. Your name was spoken only by those who needed your services. But your world shifted in those 2 days. You saw the grand games in the lower yards, knights in glistening armor, their swords clashing with brutal elegance. You heard the music from the feasting halls, harps and lutes singing of victories you had never witnessed. You smelled the spices drifting from royal kitchens, roasted meats and honeyed tarts far beyond your peasant meals of onions and boiled roots. And for the first time in years, you wondered, had you been robbed of something more? The execution day arrived under a sky as white as bone, snow falling in heavy curtains that did little to deter. The gathering crowds, lords and ladies, stood wrapped in their finest cloaks, their boots sinking into fresh drifts, their jeweled hands clutching goblets of spiced wine. The commoners pressed against the outer fences, their breath fogging in the frigid air, their eyes wide not just with hunger, but with curiosity, for they too had heard the name of the condemned, and they too hungered for spectacle. You stood upon the grand scaffold, elevated above them all, your axe polished to an unnatural gleam, your gloves pulled tight, your hood casting your face into deep shadow. The murmurs grew to a roar as the condemned was dragged forward, not a thief, not a beggar, but a nobleman whose betrayal had apparently reached the ears of the king himself. His robes were torn, his crown discarded, his face marred by days in the dungeon, yet his back remained straight, his gaze proud, even as chains rattled around his wrists. And when he looked at you, there was no fear, only contempt, because in his world, men like you were disposable, necessary, but beneath notice. The king appeared high upon his balcony, wrapped in furs worth more than your life, his voice thundering with declarations of justice, of treason punished, of order restored. The crowd cheered, the wind howled, and you performed your duty, your muscles moving with the same grim precision, your axe falling with the same ruthless efficiency. When it was done, the roar of approval swelled to deafening heights. The king nodded once before vanishing back into his gilded halls. The nobles returned to their fires and their feasts. The crowd dispersed, eager to retell the story of the day. And you remained, standing amidst the red-stained snow, the distant castle bells tolling, not for you, but for the spectacle you had provided. That evening, the steward handed you a pouch, heavier than any you had ever carried, filled with gold coins stamped with the king's seal. "Your service," he said flatly, and then you were dismissed. No feast, no seat at the long tables, no toast raised in your name. You left the castle the following dawn, the snow crunching beneath your horse's hooves, the winds nipping cruelly at your cheeks. The road home was long, the landscape bleak, and your thoughts heavier than any weight you had ever lifted. You returned to your village to find it unchanged. The church bell still tolled hollow prayers. The market still sold stale bread and watery stew. The villagers still avoided your gaze. Their children still pulled behind closed doors at the sound of your boots. And in the lonely square, your little stone dwelling waited silent, cold, and empty. You unlocked the door, stepped inside, dropped the heavy coin pouch upon the table, and stared at it, wondering what it was all for. The gold could buy you softer clothes, warmer fires, richer food, but it could not buy a friendly greeting. It could not buy a seat at any table. It could not buy an escape from the shadow you carried upon your shoulders. Years passed. Seasons changed. You grew older. Your hair thinning, your joints aching, your hands slower, your sleep more restless. Your visits to the scaffold became less frequent, your summons less urgent. Your role quietly passed to a younger man, trained by necessity, not choice. One spring morning, you stood at the edge of the village square, watching the new executioner adjust the ropes, oil the axe, repeat the same motions you had perfected over decades. No one noticed you watching. No one greeted you as you turned away. You walked back to your home, pushed open the door, sat by the cold hearth, and let the silence settle over you like an old, familiar cloak. Because, in the end, you were not a monster. You were not a hero. You were simply a man who did what others would not. A name spoken in whispers, a shadow that haunted the edge of every village gathering. A reminder that, sometimes, justice was not fair, mercy was not given, and those who kept the order of the world were doomed to live outside of it. And as you stared at the quiet flicker of the dying fire, you realized this had always been your fate, not chosen, but assigned, a duty no one wanted, a life no one envied, and a death, when it came, that no one would mourn. The snow would fall again, the world would continue, and you would fade into it, silent and forgotten, like the wind through empty gallows, the executioner, and nothing more.